June 18, 1945. And Colonel Joseph Stilwell Jr., 29 years old, operations planner on Joint Chiefs of Staff, sat in Pentagon War Room reviewing casualty statistics from Okinawa that would determine whether America invaded Japan or pursued alternative strategies, and the numbers were catastrophic: 82 days of combat on island measuring only 67 miles long, 12,520 American soldiers and Marines killed, 38,000 wounded, total American casualties of 50,008, Japanese military casualties estimated at 110,000 killed, civilian casualties between 40,000 and 150,000 depending on counting methodology, and combined death toll approaching 200,000 on island that represented 1/400th of Japan's total land area. And Stilwell, whose job was extrapolating these casualty rates to Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, calculated projections so horrifying that atomic weapons suddenly seemed preferable to conventional invasion. Stilwell had been calculating Pacific War casualty trends since Guadalcanal, had tracked how Japanese defensive tactics evolved to inflict higher American casualties as war progressed, had documented that casualty exchange ratios worsened with each successive island. Tarawa produced 1 American casualty per 2 Japanese casualties, Saipan produced 1 American per 2.5 Japanese, Peleliu 1 per 3, Iwo Jima 1 per 1, and Okinawa produced 1 American casualty per 2.2 Japanese casualties. But with unprecedented civilian deaths suggesting that combat on Japanese home islands would involve entire population, would eliminate distinction between combatants and civilians, would require Americans to fight through cities full of civilians who might resist or might die in crossfire. And this civilian dimension that Okinawa revealed made invasion casualty projections exponentially worse than previous islands suggested. The specific Okinawa statistics that concerned Stilwell most weren't total casualties, but casualty rates. American forces lost 10% of ground combat strength killed and 40% wounded over 82 days, meaning that if sustained for 6 months estimated duration for conquering Kyushu in Operation Olympic, the assault force would suffer 100% casualties requiring complete replacement. And if Honshu invasion in Operation Coronet required another 6 months, the replacement forces would also become casualties, and the mathematics suggested that invading Japan would consume entire American ground combat capability, would require mobilization exceeding World War I levels, would produce casualties that American public might not accept, especially after Germany's surrender ended European war. But casualty projections were complicated by variables that Okinawa revealed. Japanese had committed everything to Okinawa's defense, conducted over 1,900 kamikaze attacks that sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 more, organized civilian militia that blurred combatant-civilian distinction, fought with desperation, suggesting home island's defense would be even more fanatical, and Japanese propaganda indicated that entire Japanese population would resist invasion, that surrender was culturally unacceptable, that conquering Japan would require killing significant percentage of Japanese population, and this genocidal implication of conventional invasion made atomic weapons seem like humane alternative despite their revolutionary destructiveness. Stilwell's assignment from Joint Chiefs was producing casualty estimates for Operation Downfall. Colonel, President Truman requires realistic projections for invading Japan. Political advisors claim Japanese will surrender if we demonstrate willingness to invade. Military planners argue that Okinawa proves invasion will cost unsustainable casualties. Your analysis will inform decision whether to proceed with Olympic or pursue alternative strategies including atomic weapons. Provide best estimate based on Pacific War casualty trends, justify assumptions, calculate confidence intervals, deliver briefing June 30th, and Stilwell understood his calculations would influence presidential decision affecting millions of lives, would determine whether war ended through invasion or atomic weapons or negotiated settlement, would carry responsibility heavier than any staff officer normally bore. Okinawa had been bloodiest battle of Pacific War, larger than Iwo Jima, longer than Philippines campaign, deadlier than any previous island assault, and strategically essential because Okinawa provided staging bases for invading Kyushu only 350 miles away, provided airfields for supporting invasion, provided logistics hubs for concentrating forces. But tactical victory cost 50,000 American casualties and killed estimated 150,000 Japanese military and civilians. And if Okinawa, representing 1/400th of Japan's area, cost this many casualties, then conquering all of Japan's home islands would cost, Stilwell did the mathematics, between 400,000 and 1 million American casualties and between 10 million and 20 million Japanese casualties, and these numbers were so large that Stilwell rechecked calculations repeatedly, hoping he'd made errors. But mathematics were consistent. Conventional invasion would produce casualties exceeding entire Pacific War to date. April 1, 1945. Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, and 183,000 American soldiers and Marines from 10th Army under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. landed on Okinawa's western beaches in largest amphibious operation of Pacific War, larger than Normandy invasion forces measured by troops per kilometer of beach, and Private Eugene Sledge, 21 years old, Marine rifleman with 1st Marine Division who'd fought at Peleliu, hit the beach expecting devastating defensive fire that had characterized every Pacific landing. But beaches were unopposed, no artillery, no machine guns, no mortars, and Sledge, who'd been terrified during approach, now experienced eerie silence that was somehow more frightening than combat because unopposed landing meant Japanese had learned from previous defeats, had abandoned beach defenses that American naval gunfire destroyed, had retreated to prepared positions inland where American firepower advantage would be reduced. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding Japanese 32nd Army with 130,000 soldiers and militia, had studied American amphibious doctrine and concluded that beach defense was suicide, that Japanese forces would be destroyed by naval bombardment before Americans landed. That effective defense required letting Americans land unopposed, then engaging them inland where terrain and fortifications neutralized American firepower superiority, and Ushijima's defensive strategy was based on Iwo Jima lessons: underground fortifications, interlocking defensive zones, artillery positioned in caves, no wasteful banzai charges, calculated attrition designed to inflict maximum American casualties while prolonging battle to delay inevitable invasion of Japan itself. The first week's advance was deceptively easy. American forces captured 2/3 of Okinawa, including Kadena and Yantan airfields, by April 7, suffered only 1,000 casualties, and optimistic commanders predicted island would be secured within weeks. But this rapid initial progress ended abruptly when American forces reached Ushijima's main defensive line, the Shuri Line, a fortified zone across southern Okinawa's narrowest point where Japanese had concentrated artillery and positioned defensive works in terrain that prevented American maneuver. And on April 9, when Ziv Corps attacked the Shuri Line, the easy advance ended in brutal attrition warfare began that would consume 75 days and produce 50,000 casualties. Captain John Finnegan, operations officer with 96th Infantry Division, described the tactical situation at Shuri Line. "We were attacking uphill against enemy we couldn't see, taking artillery fire from positions we couldn't locate, suffering casualties from interlocking machine gun positions that covered every approach, and our supporting fires weren't working because Japanese were in caves and tunnels that artillery couldn't reach, and we realized we were fighting battle like World War I. Trench warfare where frontal assault against prepared defenses produced massive casualties without breakthrough, and division commanders understood we'd need to reduce Shuri Line position by position using flamethrowers and demolitions, which would take weeks and cost thousands of casualties." But Okinawa's unique horror wasn't just military combat, but civilian involvement. Approximately 300,000 Okinawan civilians were trapped between Japanese and American forces. Japanese military had mobilized thousands of civilians into militia called Beitaitai who fought alongside regular forces. Japanese propaganda convinced civilians that Americans would torture and kill them, creating mass suicides when American forces approached, And this civilian dimension meant American forces faced impossible choices between treating all Japanese as combatants risking civilian massacres or treating civilians as non-combatants risking casualties from civilian attacks, and the ambiguity about civilian status produced tragedy where thousands of civilians died in combat or committed suicide or were killed by Japanese forces for attempting surrender or starved because combat destroyed food supplies. The kamikaze dimension was unprecedented. Japanese launched Operation Kikusui, 10-mast kamikaze attacks between April 6 and June 22 involving over 1,900 suicide aircraft targeting American naval forces supporting the invasion, and these attacks sank 36 ships and damaged 368, producing over 9,800 naval casualties, more than ground casualties during same period, and kamikaze effectiveness proved that Japanese suicide tactics could inflict unsustainable losses even when Japan had lost conventional military capability, and the psychological impact of fighting enemy who saw death rather than victory disturbed American sailors who'd never experienced threat that couldn't be deterred. May 1945. And American forces ground forward against Shuri line measuring progress in meters per day rather than kilometers, and Private Sledge described combat that exceeded Poliliu's horror. The rain turned everything to mud, foxholes filled with water, bodies decomposed where they fell because combat was too intense to recover them. The stench was overwhelming. Japanese artillery fired continuously from positions we couldn't suppress, and every attack produced casualties without gaining ground, and men started breaking psychologically because attrition without progress destroyed morale, made soldiers question whether conquest was possible, and I watched Marines who'd survived previous battles collapse from combat fatigue because Okinawa's unrelenting intensity exceeded human endurance. The tactical problem was that Ushijima's defense in-depth had no breakthrough point. American forces would assault Japanese position, suffer casualties capturing it, advance beyond it, then receive fire from supposedly cleared positions because Japanese had reoccupied through tunnel systems, and this Sisyphean combat where nothing stayed captured, where yesterday's victories were today's battles, created psychological exhaustion that complemented physical casualties, and division psychiatrists reported that psychiatric casualties exceeded 30% in some units, soldiers who couldn't function because stress had broken them, and these psychological casualties reduced combat effectiveness as much as physical wounds did. Major General John Hodge, commanding Ziv Corps attacking Shuri Line Center, requested permission to bypass Shuri and conduct amphibious landing behind Japanese lines, cutting their supply routes. But Lieutenant General Buckner commanding 10th Army refused authorizing flanking maneuvers, arguing that American forces needed to maintain cohesive front, that amphibious landing would divide forces exposing both to defeat in detail, that methodical frontal assault despite casualties was militarily sound even if slow, and Buckner's decision to continue frontal attacks rather than attempt maneuver became controversial because frontal assault produced steady casualties while maneuver might have shortened battle though at risk of tactical setback. The rain that began May 21 transformed battlefield into swamp, vehicles bogged down making resupply impossible, wounded couldn't be evacuated, soldiers developed immersion foot from constant water exposure, artillery couldn't be moved to support attacks, and the rain lasted 10 days, turning Okinawa into muddy hellscape where combat continued despite conditions where soldiers fought Japanese defenders while fighting terrain that made movement difficult and survival miserable, and veterans compared conditions to Western Front in World War I, where mud and rain and unending artillery created environment more hostile than enemy forces. But American forces eventually broke through Shuri Line not through tactical brilliance, but through attrition. Continuous attacks over 6 weeks killed so many Japanese defenders that Ushijima couldn't maintain cohesive defense. American artillery fired over 2 million shells, destroying Japanese positions through sheer volume. Flamethrower tanks burned out defensive positions that conventional weapons couldn't suppress. And on May 31, Japanese forces abandoned Shuri Line and retreated to final defensive positions on southern Okinawa's Kiamu Peninsula, an American capture of
Shuri represented tactical victory.
But at cost that made victory bitter, 25,000 American casualties to advance 8 kilometers, approximately 2,500 casualties per kilometer, and at this rate conquering Japan's home islands would require casualties exceeding any acceptable level. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Stilwell, Colonel Stilwell's father commanding battalion in 7th Infantry Division, was killed June 3 by Japanese artillery fire after Shuri Line was secured, and the personal loss made Colonel Stilwell's casualty calculations more than academic exercise, made him understand viscerally what statistics represented: fathers and sons and brothers dying in battle whose strategic value was questionable, and Stilwell calculating invasion projections after his father's death. Felt obligation to ensure that casualties would achieve worthy objectives, that soldiers wouldn't die advancing toward inevitable conclusion that could be reached through alternative means. Throughout Okinawa battle, 300,000 Okinawan civilians experienced catastrophe that exceeded military casualties in human tragedy. Japanese military had impressed thousands into combat labor, had positioned defensive works in civilian areas making civilians targets, had convinced civilians through propaganda that American capture meant torture and death causing mass suicides, had sometimes killed civilians who attempted surrender accusing them of treason, and American forces food. Expected to fight military enemy found themselves fighting through civilian population that couldn't be separated from combatants, couldn't be protected from combat, couldn't be safely ignored because some civilians were armed, and this civilian dimension created moral crisis where American soldiers witnessed suffering they couldn't prevent and sometimes inadvertently caused. Private Bob Jackson, infantryman with 77th Infantry Division, described encountering civilians during combat. "We'd advance through villages and find civilians hiding in tombs and caves, terrified of us because Japanese had told them we'd kill them, and we'd try to reassure them. But language barriers and ongoing combat made protection impossible, and we'd move forward leaving civilians in combat zone because we couldn't evacuate them, and sometimes we'd return and find them dead, killed by artillery or crossfire or by their own hands, and the guilt was overwhelming because we were supposed to be liberators. But civilians were dying because we were there." The suicide phenomenon was particularly horrifying. Japanese propaganda had convinced Okinawan civilians that American capture would be worse than death, and when American forces approached civilian areas, thousands of civilians committed suicide, jumping from cliffs, detonating grenades, drowning themselves, and American soldiers who witnessed these mass suicides were traumatized by deaths they couldn't prevent, by civilians choosing death over rescue, by Japanese propaganda's effectiveness in convincing victims that killers were saviors, and the psychological impact of watching civilians commit suicide affected American soldiers as severely as combat casualties because witnessing preventable deaths violated soldiers' self-image as protectors. Captain David Williams, Civil Affairs Officer, attempted to establish civilian refugee camps to separate civilians from combat zones. "We set up camps and encouraged civilians to surrender, broadcast messages in Japanese promising safety. But Japanese soldiers would attack refugees leaving combat zones, killing them as examples, and civilians feared Japanese retaliation more than American attack, and the result was that most civilians stayed in combat zones rather than risk Japanese punishment for attempting surrender, and those civilians died in crossfire or from starvation or from disease, and we couldn't protect them because protecting them required defeating Japanese forces, and defeating Japanese forces required tactics that killed civilians caught in between." The final count of civilian deaths remains uncertain. Estimates range from 40,000 to 150,000 depending on methodology, whether deaths from disease and starvation during battle are counted, whether civilian militia killed by American forces are counted as military or civilian casualties, whether mass suicides are attributed to Japanese propaganda or American invasion. But any calculation shows that civilian deaths exceeded American military deaths, that Okinawan population suffered more than either combatant military force, that battle's greatest tragedy was civilian rather than military.
If you want to see how Okinawa's civilian casualties influenced atomic bomb decision, please hit that like button.
It helps us share more stories about World War II's strategic decisions.
And please subscribe if you haven't already.
The civilian catastrophe had strategic implications. If Okinawa with 300,000 civilians produced 40,000 to 150,000 civilian deaths, then invading Japan's home islands with 72 million population would produce civilian deaths in millions, would require American forces to fight through cities full of civilians who might resist or commit suicide, would create humanitarian disaster exceeding any previous war, and these projections suggested that atomic weapons, despite their horrific immediate casualties, might produce fewer total deaths than conventional invasion because invasion would produce civilian casualties over months of fighting, whereas atomic weapons would produce casualties concentrated in days, potentially shocking Japan into surrender before civilian death toll reached invasion levels.
April 6 through June 22, 1945.
And Japanese forces launched 10 major Kikusui operations, mass kamikaze attacks, involving over 1,900 suicide aircraft targeting American naval forces supporting Okinawa invasion, and Seaman First Class James Fahey, serving aboard light cruiser USS Montpelier, experienced attacks that killed more American sailors than ground combat killed American soldiers. Kamikazes came in waves. We'd shoot down dozens, but some would get through. And watching aircraft deliberately crash into ships was psychologically devastating because enemy pilot's death was his objective, and our defensive fires couldn't deter him because he welcomed death, and this created terror that conventional enemy couldn't produce because conventional enemy could be frightened.
But kamikaze couldn't be stopped unless physically destroyed before reaching target.
The naval casualty statistics were unprecedented. 36 ships sunk, including 12 destroyers, 15 amphibious ships, 9 smaller vessels, 368 ships damaged, 43 damaged so severely they never returned to service, and over 9,800 naval casualties, 4,900 killed, 4,900 wounded, and these naval casualties exceeded Army casualties during same period, meant that supporting Okinawa invasion was more dangerous than landing on Okinawa, meant that Navy was suffering attrition rate that couldn't be sustained in invasion of Japan, where kamikaze attacks would be even more intense. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding amphibious forces, reported to Nimitz that kamikaze threat was making conventional naval operations unsustainable. We are losing ships and sailors at rate that exceeds production and replacement. Kamikaze aircraft are more effective weapon than conventional bombers despite primitive guidance. And Japanese have sufficient aircraft and pilots for suicide missions to potentially defeat invasion of Japan by destroying naval forces supporting invasion. We need either to neutralize kamikaze threat through capturing all Japanese airfields, which requires conquering all of Japan, creating circular problem, or we need to end war before kamikaze attrition becomes prohibitive. The destroyer picket line, destroyers positioned between main fleet and Okinawa to provide early warning of kamikaze attacks, suffered catastrophic casualties. 15 destroyers sunk, 51 damaged, 87% casualty rate for ships on picket duty, and destroyer crews understood that picket assignment was near certain death sentence, but continued serving because picket line was essential for protecting main fleet and invasion forces, and the courage required to serve on picket line knowing survival odds were 13%. Characterized naval service at Okinawa, where sailors faced threats that training hadn't prepared them for. Lieutenant Richard Newcomb, serving aboard destroyer on picket line, described the psychological impact of facing kamikaze. You watch radar as bogies approach, you know they're suicide aircraft that can't be deterred, you shoot continuously hoping to destroy them before they reach you, and sometimes despite destroying dozens one gets through and you watch helpless as it crashes into nearby ship and that ship disappears in explosion, and you know that could be your ship tomorrow, and the psychological strain of waiting for death that comes randomly regardless of skill or courage breaks men in ways conventional combat doesn't. The strategic implication was that kamikaze threat made invasion of Japan potentially impossible. Japanese had reserved approximately 10,000 aircraft for suicide attacks against Operation Olympic, had trained pilots for one-way missions requiring minimal training, had positioned aircraft at airfields throughout Japan making suppression impossible, and naval planners calculated that 10,000 kamikaze could sink hundreds of invasion ships, could kill tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers during amphibious phase, could potentially prevent American forces from landing at all, and this possibility that invasion might be defeated through kamikaze attrition rather than ground combat influenced strategic thinking about alternatives to conventional invasion.
June 18, 1945.
80th day of battle, and Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding 10th Army, was observing 8th Marine Regiment's attack on final Japanese positions when Japanese artillery shell struck observation post, killing Buckner instantly, and Buckner became highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire during World War II, died 4 days before Okinawa was officially secured, died watching battle that had consumed 82 days and 50,000 American casualties to conquer island that measured 67 miles by 7 miles, and Buckner's death symbolized Okinawa's character where danger never diminished, where generals died alongside privates, where victory's approach didn't reduce lethality. The controversy about Buckner's generalship intensified after his death. Marine Corps commanders had argued for amphibious flanking maneuvers that might have shortened battle, had criticized Buckner's preference for frontal assaults that produce steady casualties, had suggested that Army general commanding predominantly Marine forces didn't understand Marine doctrine emphasizing maneuver over attrition. But Buckner's defenders argued that flanking operations risked tactical setback, that methodical frontal assault despite casualties was militarily sound, that alternative tactics might have produced even higher casualties if Japanese had defeated divided American forces, and the debate about whether Okinawa's casualties were unavoidable or were a result of poor generalship would continue for decades. Major General Lemuel Shepard, commanding 6th Marine Division, later wrote about tactical alternatives. We could have landed behind Shuri line, cutting Japanese supply routes and forcing their withdrawal from prepared positions. This would have avoided 75 days of frontal assault and might have reduced casualties. But General Buckner believed maintaining cohesive front was essential and rejected flanking proposals, and the result was that we attacked prepared positions frontally for 3 months, producing casualties that alternative tactics might have avoided, though we'll never know whether alternatives would have succeeded.
June 22, 1945.
82nd day, and American forces declared Okinawa secured after final Japanese positions were overrun, and the casualty count was devastating. 12,520 American soldiers and Marines killed in action, 38,000 wounded, 26,500 non-battle casualties, primarily psychiatric casualties and disease. Total American casualties of 77,044, though many sources cite 50,008 omitting non-battle casualties, and these casualties represented 35% of 10th Army's original strength, meaning more than 1 in 3 Americans who landed became casualties. Japanese military casualties were catastrophic, estimated 110,000 killed including conscripted Okinawan militia, 7,800 captured, though most captures were wounded soldiers unable to resist, meaning 93% of Japanese defenders died rather than surrender. And this near-total resistance validated Japanese propaganda that surrender was culturally impossible, that Japanese forces would fight to death rather than accept defeat, and extrapolating this resistance to home island's defense suggested that conquering Japan would require killing most of Japanese military forces and significant portion of civilian population. But civilian casualties exceeded military losses. Conservative estimates of 40,000 civilian deaths, with maximum estimates reaching 150,000 depending on counting methodology, and these civilian deaths represented between 13 and 50% of Okinawa's pre-war population, and the percentage loss was higher than any previous Pacific battle, higher than some European battles, represented catastrophe that would be exponentially worse on Japanese home islands.
Where population density was higher in Japanese propaganda would be more effective. Private Sledge survived the battle physically, but was broken psychologically. Okinawa destroyed something inside everyone who fought there: the unrelenting combat, the atrocities we witnessed, the futility of attacks that gained nothing, the deaths that accomplished little, and I came off that island questioning everything I'd believed about war and honor and duty, and the nightmares from Okinawa never stopped, and I spent decades processing trauma that couldn't be processed, and I understood that Okinawa was preview of what invading Japan would be: months of horror that would break everyone who survived. The strategic lesson was that conquering heavily defended Japanese-held territory required casualties that approached 1-to-1 exchange ratios, that American technological and numerical superiority couldn't prevent mass casualties when Japanese fought from prepared positions, that Japanese willingness to die rather than surrender made conquest require near-total destruction of defending forces. And when planners extrapolated Okinawa casualties to invasion of Japan, the projections ranged from conservative estimates of 250,000 American casualties to pessimistic estimates of 1 million, and these numbers made atomic weapons seem like humanitarian alternative despite their revolutionary destructiveness. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, reviewing Okinawa casualties, told President Truman, "Okinawa demonstrates that invading Japan will produce casualties exceeding anything American public will accept. The Japanese fought with ferocity, suggesting home island's defense will be even more desperate, and we must consider whether atomic weapons, despite their terrible power, might end war with fewer total casualties than conventional invasion would produce." June 25, 1945. And Colonel Stilwell completed casualty projections for Operation Downfall, the planned two-phase invasion of Japan, using Okinawa as baseline, and the calculations produced numbers so large that Stilwell rechecked methodology repeatedly, hoping he'd aired Operation Olympic invading Kyushu in November 1945. Would require landing 340,000 American troops against defending force of 540,000 Japanese, including civilian militia, and applying Okinawa casualty rates suggested American casualties would reach 95,000 for conquering Kyushu alone, and Operation Coronet invading Honshu in March 1946. Would require landing 1 million American troops against defending force of 2 million Japanese, and applying Okinawa casualty rates suggested American casualties would reach 400,000 for conquering Honshu, and combined casualties for both operations would total approximately 500,000 Americans killed or wounded. But Stilwell's baseline calculations were optimistic because they assumed casualty rates wouldn't increase during home island's defense. Okinawa had produced 35% American casualty rate over 82 days. But home island's defense would involve entire Japanese population, would involve terrain more defensible than Okinawa, would involve Japanese forces with shorter supply lines and better logistics, and realistic projections suggested casualty rates could reach 50% or higher. And if casualty rates increased proportionally to Japanese defensive intensity, then Operation Downfall could produce 1 million American casualties, and Stilwell, calculating 1 million casualties, understood that this number exceeded total American casualties in European theater, exceeded American casualties in entire Pacific War to date, exceeded casualties that American public would accept, especially after Germany's surrender ended European combat. The Japanese defensive preparations supported pessimistic projections. Intelligence reported that Japan had mobilized National Volunteer Combat Force, 28 million civilians aged 15 to 60 organized into militia units, had positioned 400,000 troops on Kyushu with orders to defend beaches, had reserved 10,000 aircraft for kamikaze attacks against invasion fleet, had stockpiled supplies for prolonged defense, and Japanese propaganda emphasized that defending sacred homeland was every citizen's duty even if defense required death, and these preparations suggested that home island's defense would exceed Okinawa's intensity, that Japanese would fight with desperation that Okinawa hadn't fully demonstrated.
General Douglas MacArthur commanding Southwest Pacific Forces provided competing estimate arguing that Operation Olympic would produce only 25,000 casualties in first 30 days with total casualties not exceeding 105,000, and MacArthur's optimistic projections reflected his advocacy for invasion as opposed to alternatives like blockade or atomic weapons, reflected institutional bias where ground commanders minimized casualty projections to justify operations they favored. But Stilwell analyzing MacArthur's methodology found it ignored Okinawa data, assumed Japanese resistance would collapse quickly, assumed civilian population wouldn't resist, and these assumptions contradicted everything Pacific War experience demonstrated. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief of staff, was more pessimistic, projecting that conquering Japan would require 18 months of combat producing casualties proportional to European theater, meaning approximately 500,000 American casualties based on European precedent, and Leahy's projections influenced Truman because Leahy had no institutional bias toward any particular strategy, had reputation for honest assessment, and Leahy's support for finding alternatives to invasion carried weight that MacArthur's optimistic projections couldn't match. The specific calculation Stilwell presented to Joint Chiefs on June 30 was, Operation Downfall will produce between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties depending on assumptions about Japanese resistance intensity, civilian participation, and casualty rate trends. Conservative estimate using Okinawa baseline suggests 500,000 casualties. Japanese casualties will reach 5-10 million. Military and civilian deaths. Battle duration will be 6 to 18 months. These projections are based on Pacific War casualty trends showing progressive worsening of exchange ratios as American forces approach Japan. Alternative strategies including atomic weapons and blockade should be evaluated against these casualty projections. Truman, reading Stilwell's projections, understood that invasion casualties would be politically unsustainable. European war had ended May 8. American public expected rapid demobilization. Families whose sons had survived Europe couldn't accept them dying in Pacific, and casualties reaching 500,000 would require political explanation that conventional military necessity couldn't provide, and Truman, who'd assumed presidency only 3 months earlier after Roosevelt's death, now faced decision about using atomic weapons with understanding that refusing their use would require accepting casualties that might destroy his presidency. July 16, 1945. 0529 hours, an atomic bomb codenamed Gadget detonated at Trinity site in New Mexico desert, producing explosion equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, and scientists who'd spent 3 years developing atomic weapon watched as mushroom cloud rose 8 miles high, proving that theoretical weapon was practical reality, and military observers who'd been briefed on weapons purpose understood that successful test meant America possessed alternative to Operation Downfall, possessed weapon that might end war without invasion, projected to cost 1 million casualties, and the strategic calculation immediately became whether using atomic weapon against Japanese cities would produce fewer total casualties than conventional invasion. President Truman was at Potsdam Conference negotiating with Stalin and Churchill when news arrived that Trinity test succeeded, and Truman's diary entry recorded, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in history. It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah. This weapon gives us means to end war without invasion. That military planners' project will cost 500,000 American casualties. I will authorize use against Japan if they reject surrender ultimatum. We will issue, the responsibility is mine. But alternative is invasion that will kill millions." The immediate strategic question was target selection. Military planners recommended Hiroshima and Nagasaki as targets because they were military industrial centers that hadn't been heavily bombed, allowing clear assessment of atomic weapons effects. But planners understood that atomic weapons would kill civilians on unprecedented scale, that single bomb would kill more civilians than conventional bombing raids that killed thousands,
that using atomic weapons crossed moral threshold that conventional weapons didn't, and debate within Truman administration focused on whether atomic weapons' revolutionary destructiveness made them qualitatively different from conventional weapons or whether they were simply more efficient methods achieving military objectives that conventional weapons pursued less effectively. Secretary of War Stimson argued that atomic weapons use was justified by invasion alternative. We faced choice between using atomic bombs killing perhaps 200,000 Japanese or invading Japan killing perhaps 5 million Japanese and 1 million Americans. The moral calculation clearly favors atomic weapons despite their terrible power because they minimize total deaths, and Japanese refusal to surrender despite military defeat being obvious creates moral responsibility for continued war deaths that argues for using any weapon that ends war quickly. But some scientists who developed atomic weapons opposed their use. Leo Szilard and other Manhattan Project scientists petitioned Truman arguing that demonstrating weapon on uninhabited island would convince Japan to surrender without killing civilians, that using weapon against cities would establish precedent for atomic warfare that future conflicts would follow, that demonstrating weapon first gave Japan opportunity to surrender before Americans killed Japanese civilians. But Truman rejected demonstration proposal arguing that Japan had ignored previous warnings, that demonstration might fail to convince Japan if weapon didn't perform as expected, that America had only 2 atomic bombs available meaning wasting one on demonstration was strategically irresponsible. The Potsdam Declaration issued July 26 gave Japan ultimatum, surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction, and declaration didn't mention atomic weapons because American leaders wanted Japan to believe destruction referred to conventional invasion allowing them to surrender without knowing about atomic weapons, and Japanese government rejected Potsdam Declaration publicly though some leaders privately favored acceptance, and rejection gave Truman justification for proceeding with atomic attacks. Colonel Stilwell was briefed on atomic bombs' existence and understood that his casualty projections had influenced decision to use it. My calculations showing that invasion would cost 1 million American casualties were cited by President and Secretary Stimson as justification for atomic weapons, and I understood that my analysis helped determine that hundreds of thousands of Japanese would die from atomic weapons, and the moral weight of that calculation was heavy because I'd contributed to decision that would kill so many. But alternative was invasion that would kill even more, and facing choice between terrible outcomes chose the less terrible. August 6, 1945. 0815 hours local time, and B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima, and weapon detonated 1,800 feet above city producing explosion that instantly killed 70,000 to 80,000 people, destroyed 5 square miles of urban area, and initiated radiation deaths that would eventually kill 140,000 by year's end, and weapons' unprecedented destructiveness accomplished strategic objective, demonstrated to Japan that America possessed weapon that could destroy Japanese cities instantly without invasion, that continued resistance was futile, that surrender was only option preventing Japan's complete destruction. Emperor Hirohito convened Supreme War Council after Hiroshima bombing, argued that atomic weapons' existence changed strategic calculus, that defending home islands against invasion was one matter, but defending against weapon that destroyed cities instantly was impossible, and Hirohito's personal intervention began process leading to surrender though process wasn't complete before America dropped second atomic bomb. August 9, 1945. 1102 hours local time, and B-29 bomber Boxcar dropped atomic bomb nicknamed Fat Man on Nagasaki after primary target Kokura was obscured by clouds, and weapon detonated producing explosion that killed approximately 40,000 immediately with total deaths reaching 70,000 by year's end, and second bombing demonstrated that America possessed multiple atomic weapons, that Hiroshima wasn't unique event, but was beginning of campaign that would continue until Japan surrendered, that further resistance would result in additional Japanese cities being destroyed. August 15, 1945.
And Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in radio broadcast. First time Japanese public heard Emperor's voice, and Hirohito's surrender speech cited new and most cruel bomb as reason for surrender. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would result in the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, and Hirohito's explicit reference to atomic weapons validated Truman's calculation that weapons would achieve surrender without invasion. The final accounting of atomic weapons casualties compared to Operation Downfall projections: atomic weapons killed approximately 210,000 Japanese civilians immediately and eventually. Operation Downfall was projected to kill 1 million Americans and 5 to 10 million Japanese over 18 months of combat, meaning atomic weapons produced fewer total deaths than invasion would have produced.
And this arithmetic justified Truman's decision, no moral debate about whether arithmetic justified killing civilians with weapons of unprecedented power would continue for decades.
Stilwell, writing in his diary, reflected on atomic weapons ending war his casualty projections had predicted would cost million American lives. The bombs killed 200,000 Japanese and saved million American lives and millions more Japanese lives that invasion would have cost. My casualty projections were used to justify using weapons, and I believe decision was correct because alternative was worse. But the certainty of deaths weapons caused versus hypothetical deaths invasion might have caused creates moral ambiguity that numbers cannot resolve. Today at Okinawa Peace Memorial Park, stone walls inscribed with names of all who died in battle, American, Japanese, Okinawan, record 240,000 names, and memorials existence acknowledging all victims regardless of nationality reflects Okinawa's character as battle where military and civilian casualties merged, where conquest's cost was measured not in strategic gain, but in human suffering, where victory was so expensive that it convinced American leadership to seek alternative to invasion even if alternative meant using weapons of unprecedented destructive power. And the memorial's message is that Okinawa's casualties ended World War II by making invasion unthinkable. The strategic significance was that Okinawa proved invasion of Japan would cost casualties that American public wouldn't accept, 82 days producing 50,000 American casualties for island measuring 67 by 7 miles, extrapolating to conquering Japan's home islands produced projections of 1 million American casualties over 18 months. And these projections made atomic weapons seem preferable despite their revolutionary destructiveness, made ending war through technological breakthroughs seem more humane than ending war through conventional invasion requiring millions of deaths. Private Sledge, who survived Okinawa, wrote memoir titled With the Old Breed, describing battle's impact. Okinawa was the worst battle of the Pacific War, worse than Peleliu, worse than anything Marines had experienced, and everyone who fought there was broken by it. And when atomic bombs ended the war before we invaded Japan, everyone who'd fought on Okinawa understood that bombs had saved us from experiencing Okinawa again multiplied by 100, and I never questioned whether using atomic weapons was moral because I'd seen what alternative was. The counterfactual question remains controversial. Would atomic weapons have been used if Okinawa's casualties had been lower, if American planners had projected that invasion would cost 200,000 casualties instead of 1 million, if Japanese defense hadn't demonstrated absolute resistance requiring near-total destruction, and historians debate whether Okinawa's casualties were sufficient justification for atomic weapons or whether other factors including Soviet entry into Pacific war would have produced Japanese surrender regardless. But historical record shows that casualty projections based on Okinawa were explicitly cited as justification for Truman's decision. General MacArthur, who'd advocated for invasion before Okinawa, changed position after reviewing casualties. After Okinawa, I concluded that invading Japan would produce casualties exceeding anything American military had experienced,
that alternative means of ending war should be pursued even if those alternatives included atomic weapons, and I support a decision to use atomic weapons, though I believe naval blockade and conventional bombing might eventually produce surrender without atomic weapons or invasion. But certainty was that invasion would kill millions while atomic weapons might end war quickly. The final assessment is that Okinawa's 200,000 total casualties, American, Japanese, civilian, influenced strategic decision that ended World War II and prevented casualties that Operation Downfall would have produced. 1 million American casualties projected, 5 to 10 million Japanese casualties projected, versus 210,000 Japanese casualties from atomic weapons. And arithmetic strongly favors atomic weapons despite their revolutionary destructiveness, and Truman's decision to authorize their use was based substantially on casualty projections extrapolated from Okinawa. That's Okinawa's legacy, not just Bloodiest Pacific battle, but the battle whose casualties convinced American leadership that invasion of Japan would be prohibitively expensive, that alternative strategies including atomic weapons should be pursued, that ending war through technological breakthrough was preferable to ending war through conventional invasion. 82 days. 200,000 total casualties. 50,000 American casualties. 110,000 Japanese military casualties. 40,000 to 150,000 civilian casualties. Casualties that made invading Japan unthinkable. Casualties that ended World War II. Colonel Stilwell calculated that invasion would cost 1 million American lives. His calculations influenced Truman's decision to use atomic weapons. 210,000 died from atomic weapons instead of millions from invasion. That's the mathematics that ended World War II. Terrible arithmetic where choosing between catastrophic outcomes meant choosing the less catastrophic. Where Okinawa's casualties convinced leaders that preventing even worse casualties justified using weapons of unprecedented power. The names on memorial walls remember all who died. The strategic decision their deaths influenced ended the war and prevented millions more deaths. That's Okinawa's contribution to history.